Okay, cool. So thanks again, Rob. If you could give just a brief background on yourself, and then we can just roll right into it. And Rob has a hard stop at the hour mark, so we'll go crush it for an hour, and then he has other obligations. So I appreciate the 60-minute time frame you do have.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. Thanks everyone for inviting me. So, yeah, my name's Rob Gray. I'm a professor at Arizona State University. My background, originally training, is in psychology, kind of looking at a lot of perception and vision kind of things. And I've also done, I did for a while as a sport science department in Birmingham, England. So I've done kind of motor control, biomechanics side of things too. I do right now. I kind of do research a lot on skill acquisition, motor learning. I do a fair amount of consulting with sports teams, and some of you may know I have a podcast I do called Perception and Action Podcast, where I talk a lot about these things. And I'm particularly getting more interested in the injury rehab side of things of this. And there's a lot of work on coaching, obviously, and practice design, but I think a lot of these ideas have implications for injury as well. So.
Perfect. And do you want to chat about the specific paper you chose, and then how the podcast kind of relates? But yeah, maybe a brief intro on the paper.
Sure. Yeah. So this was a study I did several years ago. I don't remember exactly when I started the idea, and it was built off some well-known work by mostly some person named Gabby Wolf, who's at UNLV. She's been studying focus of attention for a long time. And there's a very large body of work showing that when you're learning a skill and when you're performing a skill, for the most part, it's better to have what's called an external focus of attention versus an internal focus. And sometimes the definitions of those things get a little tricky. But basically, internal focus of attention is focusing on how you produce the movement. So how, if you're hitting a ball or catching a ball, it's focusing on what your elbow is doing, where your leg is. Anyone watching the Olympics right now, I would guess that's a large part of what's happening with Simone Biles, right? She's got what's called the twisties gymnastics have, because she started to focus on the actual mechanics of her movement while she's spinning in the air, which for really skilled athlete is disastrous, right? You got to get your conscious attention out of there. You don't want it to be trying to control things where you're going to mess things up. So that's an internal focus of attention, focusing on how you actually produce the skill. There's a large body of research showing that leads to inferior performance, inferior learning, with some caveats and subtleties. External focus on attention is focusing on the outcome of your movement. So focusing on, the movement of your bat or the club, or where you're going to land, or focusing on something external in the environment, rather than focusing on yourself. And research has shown that that external is typically better. So in the typical study you do on this, you give people instructions. You say, in this condition, I want you to focus on the force of your feet on the ground, or how much your elbow is bending. That's an internal condition. And then you compare that to an external one where you say, I want you to focus on the movement of the club, or the movement of the ball after it leaves your bat, or something like that, and you compare performance. And so that's kind of the background. This study, I got interested in the idea that potentially injury causes people to adopt an internal focus, right? You, for a variety of reasons, you in a lot of physiotherapy is very internally focused instructions. Keep your knees over your ankle, your heels. In the exercises, you're really encouraging people to focus on their body. To prevent injury, again, you might be really focused on your knee, what your knee's doing if you're from surgery, and so on. I thought this might be something that could impair people's recovery. And so what I did was, in the study, was I recruited people, baseball players, hitters that had recovering from knee surgery, that had ACL surgery, and pitchers that were recovering from UCL surgery. With the UCL is the ligament in your elbow. I think most people know. It's very, very common for baseball pitchers to have that torn and have to have it repaired or replaced. So I looked at that, and what I did was use a task. I have a kind of a batting virtual environment, a VR setup, and a pitching setup in the lab. And I use that, and I tried to look at what people were focusing on in comparison to either novices or people that were at their same level but not injured. And I found that people that were injured were actually, there was strong evidence they were focusing on what their body was doing, and they weren't performing as well. They were focusing on the batters were focusing on their knee. If you ask them to make a judgment, well, how much was your knee bent while you're swinging, they were very good at it because they were kind of focusing on it too much. And pitchers were kind of focusing on everything about their movement of their body. So it kind of confirmed the idea that after your injury, you kind of adopt this internal focus on what you're doing, and which is you need to kind of get away from if you can in some way. As I said, there's lots of ways. Pressure is the other main way that kind of gets people to do this, adopt this internal focus. So that kind of confirmed, well, kind of supported that idea in that study. And the other, since I did that, what I've been getting to and thinking about a lot in that podcast episode, I tried to talk about this, was the idea of moving away from, I like to get rid of the word rehabilitation, because what I think we need to adopt more is that when you get injured or you get something like that, it actually fundamentally changes who you are, your body, your mechanics and things like that, so that you can't really ever go back, right? You're really talking about adapting to a new system, which athletes do all their life, and people do all their life as you grow, as the environment changes. But trying to get back to where you were, rehabilitating, I think is kind of maybe the wrong way to think about it. And I think part of it is these attentional changes. For example, there's actually shown research showing that I talked about in that episode, I think, that ACL injuries lead to functional changes in your brain chemistry, the brain areas. So things like that. So I think for me, it's kind of a bigger picture of what we need to understand is that when people get injured, they're adapting to this new constraints. That's another word you might hear in this area. New constraints of what they're focusing attention on, what their body can do, pain, all those kind of things. And I think we need to take into account what those are, and and think of it as adapting to a new situation rather than getting back to where they were before. So maybe I'll leave it there, Chris. I don't know. I could say, is there any kind of general questions anyone had about the study or anything like that, or the podcast? I'm not sure the best one. If it were Chris, I don't know if you have one like to get us rolling.
Yeah, I always have questions.
Yeah, or a thought or something. Yeah.
Yeah, off that last point, the idea of like adapting to the injury instead of rehabbing it, where do you feel like it gets messy with, let's say it's an elite athlete or a high-level athlete, where maybe what makes them successful, they is potentially more injurious, and then you're trying to change or create more strategies. How do you walk that fine line between changing the skill moving forward or the way to perform it versus giving them more options, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Yeah, I think part of it is, I think I think a large part of what recovering from injury should be is more like kind of body awareness, learning what your body can do and what's available. I think instead of restricting everything to let's do just this movement, these movements, learning more about what you're capable of. I think it is kind of, I think one way we can approach rehabilitation. I think giving people more opportunity to kind of develop, by giving them a more variable practice environment, focusing on just these sets of movements. Let's focus on kind of functional movements. So yeah, I think that's kind of where I balanced it out, right? Trying to, and if people can take some of what they learned before, obviously, into a new situation for sure. Yeah. Does anyone, I didn't know if there was any, do you, in rehab and physiotherapy, are people kind of aware of the internal, external instructions, and have people started to change that at all, or taking that into account?
I would assume so.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully, it's not really taught in our program, but from a I think practical standpoint and what's being taught in other settings like strength conditioning or more progressive PT and rehab, it is like more well known. But I would say there's still a lot of PTs that really do a lot of internal cueing or just create very hyper vigilant movement. But I think it's moving in a better direction. I don't know if Mike or Paul have better answers since y'all have seen more.
I think we just got called old, Mike. I mean, I will say that there's times where we place constraints so that we're loading specific tissues, right? But when we're looking at an athletic movement profile, then that's where we allow a little more freedom of movement for them to explore and see what they're trying to do, right? So it's really where are we in this course of rehabilitation? What is our target? If I'm trying to strengthen the quads, I need to make sure that they're loading the quads. And so I put more constraints so that I'm making sure that I'm getting the quads to be part of this movement. But later, I'm not trying to have them use their quads to jump per se. I'm having their whole body involved in their movement for a jump or for absorption or whatever it is, right? So that's where we have a much more open format as far as how they're going to go through. So it's really where are we and what are we trying to do within whatever movement that we're trying to accomplish. And so that's where I think sometimes this gets lost, is we're giving some where we might need some more constraints and some more refinement of movement early, right? And then we're applying these open-ended things. And so we may not be getting what we're wanting, and we're getting some stress shielding in the leg or some of these other things. And we need to constrain that. And then we can move, once they've shown that they have some of these things, into a much more open format where they're having external focuses and cues so that we're just getting more movement options for the athlete.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Paul. I like to, when I talk, I like to distinguish between what I call capacity and a skill. Like strength and flexibility and speed are capacities that, if you develop those, they will give you the opportunity to be more skillful when you start doing more not that those aren't movements that have certain requirements and coordination, but when you get more functional movements, like in sports and doing activities, if you have those things. And you're right, I think, the best way to develop strength in your quads is not playing soccer, right? You need to constrain things more than that, right? So I think I've always thought that, we could make a better connection between S and C and skill training. If we kind of thought that, like you said, it's a progression from what you're focusing on. Where are you in the stage of what you want to do? Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Yeah. No, the internal, external in sports as well, in coaching, it's still, there's been some studies where they analyze what coaches say and they ask people, and it's still, there's still kind of a slow adoption of it. And I don't think it's a hard, fast rule that you can never focus on someone's body either. I think there's times for it and places for it as well. So
you brought up the Simone Biles situation. What are your thoughts with gymnastics or dance or figure skating, where so much of it is on the kind of aesthetic execution, where you have to potentially be more aware of body segments and you're smiling and etc. Obviously that becomes more automatic as you go through it, but does that change when it's a sport that's not just performance based, it's also how they look doing it?
Yeah, I think so. I think those are call form sports, where there's constraints on the actual movement, right? Like not only does it have to achieve some function of landing on your feet and flipping, it has to look a certain way. You're right. There's more constraints on the way that we achieve. So I think you do probably have to have more awareness, or at least, whether that's kind of conscious awareness or not. I think that adds a lot more to learning those skills than, I think it makes, I like to say that, in most skills, there's kind of a set of invariant features that have to be there. And then there's a lot of variance in between. Like in swinging a golf club, you have to transfer the force, you have to have the club square, you have to contact and things like that. But between those points, you look at the golfers have different positions, different things. Whereas with form sports, there's just more invariance, things that have to be the same if you want to get a certain way, if you want to be get the top score, because it's based on form as well as function. So I think we could use some of the same practice things, but I think it's just a much more constrained type of movement. Yeah. But I think it's a really interesting. Before I did this study, I said to you guys, I've done a lot of ones where we try to induce pressure and kind of get the same effects, where people start focusing on their body more when you put them under pressure. We have this tendency, we want to control things when it means a lot. And that's not always the best thing to do. We want to top-down control. Yeah. So I think it's interesting.
I got really lost in the podcast when you were talking about there's decreased variability in more elite athletes, but there's higher, I think you said covariation.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right? Could you explain the difference between different types of variability that you may see in novice, first, more advanced, and then how can you even measure those differently?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question, and it's a really so variability. I like to say, so there's variability in the outcome, right? So where you contact the ball, where you land, where you think. You want, in all elite athletes, you expect that to be low, right? They consistently produce outcome. The thing that's kind of changed in the way we think is the variability of the movement that creates that, right? To produce consistent movement outcomes, you need to produce consistent movements, and that really changed. I don't know how much this guy has gotten into therapy, but there's a movement scientist, Nikolai Bernstein, who is a Russian movement scientist, and he did some famous studies where he looked at blacksmiths hammering a chisel, and he did some movement traces, and he famously found that they were hitting the chisel exactly the same place every time, but their movements were slightly different every time. Their hammer was following different paths, their arms were moving different ways. And so he coined the term repetition without repetition, right? So you repeat the outcome, but not by repeating the same movement over and over again. So we have this variability in movement, and there's various ways you can pull apart within that, the good variability, the covariation, and the bad variability. There's this big fancy name method called the uncontrolled manifold analysis that people do. Basically, any kind of variation that keeps you within your goal is kind of good. Any kind that moves you away is bad. And there's also there's some interesting studies, for example, on running that show people if you measure variability in the joint angles during their stride, people that are suffering from patellar pain have lower variability. There's less variability in their movement. So I think this is an increasing idea too, that variability in movement is actually a protective mechanism against injury. If you produce the movement exactly the same way every time, that's a great way to hurt yourself, right? The exact same muscles putting the exact same loads everywhere. You want to distribute it. You want to use slightly different movement to produce the same outcome. It's kind of a growing idea. But yeah, there are various ways to kind of separate it. And the good basic idea is that of the covariation idea, is that my things are going to work together. So if I'm trying to hit a ball, try to spike a volleyball, and my shoulder starts rotating a bit slow for whatever reason, I compensate for that by speeding up my elbow extension, right? So my elbow and shoulder are varying, but they're working together. One of them is compensating for the fact the other one's a bit slow. So that they're working together. Sometimes it's called a synergy, motor synergy. That's the basic idea. So if you measure my performance over and over, you'd see on trial to trial, I'm not using the same rate of shoulder rotation or elbow extension. They're varying, but they're varying kind of functionally like that. If that makes sense.
So using the blacksmith example, where the outcome was consistent and the same, how would you even like, and we don't have to use the blacksmith, but how would you even teach something like that? Like maybe in the rehab setting, if like maybe some of it is so hard to notice or so hard to perceive. Like, I don't know, I'm just thinking about it in a rehab setting, like we give movement variability by like potentially giving different like training stimulus in different positions, but is that actually transferring over to like variability of doing it during the sport?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, having variability. So if we want, that's the other type of variability, I would say. So outcome variability, movement variability, then practice condition variability, the conditions. So I think the more you can vary the conditions, you know, there's a recent study I looked, I don't know if I talked about it in that episode, where they looked at volleyball blocking, and they show that the type of thing we do in practice is very planned movements, right? And I see this a lot too. The blocker in practice knows exactly where they're going to block at the net. So they've been told by the coach. If you do more unplanned movements, you find, so this in this study, the person would start running towards the net, and then a light would go on telling them where they had to block after they'd already started the movement. You get more variability, right? So doing more variability in the constraints, having a wider range of conditions, I think adopts this. The main part of it though, I don't know, in coaching is not trying to restrict it, right? The old view of coaching in sports is variability is bad, noise, any kind of inconsistency in your golf swing, we don't want to allow it, right? We're going to correct that. Your elbow was slightly extended on that swing. So strict repetition, of movements is kind of the old way we teach. So allowing for people to have some variation and some individuality, picking out kind of the key things that need to be there, you think need to be there, and then allowing people to kind of adapt and develop their own way to do it. So like I can give you an example. One of the ones that I work with baseball pitchers a lot, and a lot of the pitchers, they're doing well at a certain level, but they have this problem where essentially during their delivery, their arm is flying way out, right? So they're taking all the force in the kinetic chain and they're putting it all in their arm at the back. They're kind of whipping it and they're putting all in their elbow, which works, but over time they're going to blow out their elbow. So the old way we would do that would be to tell them exactly what to do, right? Stop, bend your elbow, keep it against your body, whatever. What we do now is we use what's called a connection ball. So we take a rubber ball and stick it against the body. And so if your arm flies open, the ball flies out and out to the side. So what we tell people is throw the ball so that the connection ball goes forward with the baseball. So we're not telling people what to do. We're not telling you have to do it a certain way. We're not getting rid of variability. We're just adding a constraint that kind of pushes you in the direction you want. So for me, it's like you still have key points. So the blacksmith example, the blacksmith, he can't swing underhand or something sideways. So there's still features of the movement you want there, and you still have to coach and instruct around. But other than that, I think we need to allow a bit more variability and things like that. Yeah. sorry, I got off on a tangent there. Yeah.
How much of this variation, though, like on the blacksmith, or even in the picture where we're accelerating our elbow extension, those are unconscious things, right? So we're working within our constrained environment, but our body is naturally adapting to some of the feedback that it's getting, knowing what its task is. And that just comes from thousands and thousands of reps and failing and learning, the body seeing and getting that feedback loop. So some of this is just, you just got to do a lot of this to get mastery of what that is and allow the body to make those micro adaptations as it needs to within the sporting environment as things are moving fast, right? I mean, that's just kind of almost natural.
For sure. Yeah, it does. And I think definitely it's not something conscious, like there's not enough time to kind of do it. And I think we, as a, in practice and, training, we can facilitate that by giving people the opportunity to kind of learn more. So in baseball pitching, sometimes we do weird things like make people throw on a uphill slope, or make people throw from different distances. So we're giving them a chance to learn this kind of relationship between what their body does and where the ball goes and things. But you're right, it has to be in the actual movement itself. It's pretty hard if you're going to break it all apart and try to teach a blacksmith just this part of the they won't learn that overall compensation and things like that. But yeah, so that I think that the variability of practice thing has been around a long time, but I think we're getting more to understanding how to do it and how it affects movement.
Ashish had a question in the chat. He said, in rehab, we can train in a way to focus on external cues, but in a real game time situations, athletes might focus internally on their mechanics, etc. Does this stage of the game, fatigue, etc., affect this focusing?
Yeah, it can. I think, like I said, one of the, pressure, any kind of thing, penalty kicks in soccer is another, people study a lot. You suddenly, go to start to thinking about exactly how you're going to kick the ball when you've been doing that all game without thinking about it at all. So I think that can do it. Yeah, that's the kind of main thing. I'm not sure if I've seen fatigue effects or stage of it, but it's mostly this when people kind of think it's more important, right? And also when people go on a kind of performance slump is another one. Like if you have a game where you're really struggling, it can get you to kind of turn inwards and try to fix it, right? That's another common situation. So there are definitely a few different ways it can happen. And you probably it's related. The one we're talking about with Simone Biles is almost very similar to the yips, which you get in a lot of different sports, where people lose the ability to do very simple kind of movements. Golf and baseball, you get pitchers that can't throw straight anymore, and they start hitting batters and things. So yeah, it can. There's a variety of different things that can cause it. Yeah.
I have a question. If
Sure.
anybody, yeah. So I'm thinking about the and correct me if I misheard you. Did you say that the stress of performance is different than the stress of fatigue as it relates to like an outcome or an internal versus external locus? What did you? Yeah, I don't know if I caught that fully.
Yeah. So yeah, they're both kind of I would say they're kind of constraints that change how you perform. I find that the pressure one just has a very different effect than fatigue. Fatigue can lead to adjustments in the movement that can be maladaptive in a lot of ways. Sometimes I'm sure you guys see, but they don't seem to be the kind of the same mechanism of this internal focus. If anything, people when you get really tired and low energy, you don't tend to try to control things. You kind of just let them go. But it can get kind of maladaptive for other reasons, right? When people get fatigued. So I think they're both constraints that can affect the performance, but for probably different reasons in most cases. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah. No, definitely. I'm thinking of ways to. So if I'm, for example, like working with a high-level golfer, and they have that issue of that performance, the stress of the performance. And if I'm working with them in a gym setting, I'm thinking of ways like, how can I recreate that stress? How can I get them to that point, that point where, like, can I train that in a gym, right? So for example, like put them through a workout, get them fatigued, get them to a certain point, see if they, see what effect that has on their performance. Like, how can I recreate that, as opposed to, like, it being the Friday of a match or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I think there's a couple of different things. So pressure, recreating the effects of pressure. Obviously, you cannot recreate the pressure of the Olympics in a gym in any way, in shape or form. But what we find is that, pressure training, a couple of things, like any kind of like social pressure, where you put people in groups and say, we're going to have this little competition. Another one I like to use a lot is, I have people in a little group and I tell them, the person that scores the worst is going to have to give a little speech in front of everybody, like public speaking. So most people don't like public speaking. So it gets them to start thinking about, we want to try to get them to start thinking about what they're doing and the consequences of it. And you want them to get used to it, and try to, and the other kind of fundamental difference is, with pressure and stress, you really don't want to do anything. You don't want to change at all in response to it, right? The really great athletes, from what I've seen in studies, clutch is not changing, it's staying the same. It's doing what you always did, despite the huge difference in consequences. Whereas fatigue is something you need to adjust to, because your body's changing and what it can do is changing, and you need to make adjustments. And so I think with fatigue, it's kind of the specificity principle. I've seen, I worked with one basketball team one time, and they were trying to work with a shooter that was they were losing their form when they got tired in the fourth quarter. So I asked them, when do you work on this with them? Oh, right at the start of practice, right? You have to recreate the fatigue, right? If you want to, to coach around that. So I think more of a specificity kind of principle with fatigue, I think. But you could do it in a lot of different ways. It doesn't necessarily have to be the same. Getting them to do a bunch of leg lifts before. There's the kind of research showing that will have an effect on how people learn skills and adapt, for sure. So, but yeah, good.
Thank
good
you
question.
so much. Yeah.
Thank
you.
Are there, I don't know how much you work with or watch PTs or any of the rehab team with the teams you consult for baseball or at ASU, but are there things where you're just like, you shake your head with how annoying or frustrated it is seeing some of this stuff from like a motor learning or skill acquisition that you feel like you should share?
I don't know. I think they've been getting a lot better. I think the ones that I've worked with. So it's more on the practice side of things. I'll not so much the PT. Like I'll see, the one that frustrates me a lot is I'll see a coach set up a situation where to let kind of players explore and learn things. Like a common one in soccer, there's this thing called small-sided games. So where you reduce the number of players and spacing. The idea of that is to let players kind of explore and learn, different things. But I've seen coaches, they set that up, and then 30 seconds they're in there yelling at the players, do this, do that. You kind of totally defeated the purpose of what the whole thing was. So I see that. In rehab, no, I haven't seen as much. I've seen some really good things, like much more movements that are more related to the skill that look like to me. With some of the baseball players, instead of doing the like traditional bench press or squat, they're doing more, things that seem to have more of the movements involved in the actual action. So that's part of it. More, I guess the biggest thing that I've noticed is in the sport I work in, baseball, is the, I think there's three, the kind of why we believe cause people get hurt has mostly been overuse and bad technique, right? In baseball, there's this tendency to baby pitchers. Like we really have to avoid them throwing too much, throwing too hard. We really don't give them a chance to adapt to those forces and things in a lot of ways, or at least not in an effective way. So that's kind of I know that's a really hard problem. Like making sure you allow people to adapt the forces they're going to experience without hurting them is a balance, right? But I think sometimes it gets frustrating to me with how much we kind of baby in things. We focused on overuse, as the main cause of everything. That makes sense.
So going back, you use the example of like bench press and some other things not related or not as specific to, like, say, baseball. Mm-hmm. My thought is that you can't really do anything that specific or like functional that like in a rehab setting. Mm-hmm. In regards to like, is the goal to do things like what is your like perception of what like rehab should look like, and what is the downside to doing something like a deadlift or a bench press for like a baseball player, if that makes sense?
Yeah. I don't think there's a down. Like I guess I don't think we shouldn't be doing those. I think we just add these other ones in as well to get a broader range of movements in the exercise. So it's not just doing that.
So what examples would you use? Like, let's stick with the baseball one. What like would you add as a
so doing, I don't know, I can't remember what you call, where you have like a bar with one end of it on the ground and one kind of doing more of this, moving around, getting more range of motion, more things than just very limited. I think with a shoulder injury, I think there's a tendency, we gotta just keep it in this exact, range so we don't re-injury, where I think we need to add and allow a person to feel, learn what their body can do and learn what they're, rather than kind of restrict everything and keep it super safe. So I think there's a place for both, definitely, but I like to see that they're adding that in. What I've seen a lot of now with pitching, I really like, is in spring training, I don't know how many people are baseball fans, but in spring training, they have pitchers go and pitch a little bit, and then they'll immediately go to the gym and they'll start doing a bunch of exercises. So they're trying to build up their strength and endurance and stuff but not all just throwing. So they're kind of trying to stretch them out, but not just by throwing. They're trying to add gym workouts immediately after, which I thought that was a really interesting idea. So they get used to kind of the forces and the requirements, but it's not just all through throwing, which can, you want to build that up a little bit for sure.
What about the use of, like, if we stick with baseball, the use of like weighted balls that are a little bit heavier? I know there's a place up in the Northeast, and it's in Florida as well, Cressy Performance, that mainly specialize with baseball, and they do a lot of like, they'll do medicine ball like throws and stuff, but they also, I think they use like weighted baseballs. And from, I think, just like I'm curious your perspective from like a skill standpoint or variability. Does that almost like mess with the skill of throwing, or is it actually better because it is adding in more like variability?
Yeah, no, I'm a big fan of kind of varying the equipment. I think it gives you more of what, like Paul was saying, learning the relationship between your body and the movement, getting the experience. So yeah, I like using weighted balls a lot. Lighter balls, I use weighted bats, like shift the bat weight around. There's a theoretical approach that called differential learning. It's where basically what you're trying to do is get people to kind of explore the movement space in all possible ways, even if it goes outside of where they're going to actually end up in their sport. So different size equipment, different body postures, different stances, and through this, they're kind of learning what their body can do, and that helps them in the end. So yeah, so I'm a big believer in that. I think there was a huge hesitance to that, and long tossing, so tossing from different distances, not just the mound. I think I do like a lot of those things for sure.
Some of that goes back to why we don't want sport specificity, right? I mean, that's just learning to move how your body in space in real time with variable actors in there in multiple different sports allows you to have greater movement variability, right? And sometimes I think we in the PT space, we in the strength and conditioning space conflate our abilities to be sport specific, because the reality is one, we're not skill coaches, right? And so we're really not there for skill. We're there to prepare for the skill. And so while we can mimic somewhat, it's not really our jobs to give them the skill of their sport. It's to prepare them for the stressors of that sport, right? And so if we're a somewhat similar, that's okay, but that shouldn't be the prime drive, assuming that they're still lacking some strength or some conditioning or some other kind of basic tenet that they need prior to that, right? So some of the long toss, some of the weighted balls, that's not during the season, right? That's a prep phase, right? So it's where are we in their rehab? Where are we in their course of return to sport or in their sport? And then we have to always remember that we're not the skill coach. We need to be able to default to that skill coach. Very few of us are the actual skill coach. I mean, if you're dealing with maybe runners or weightlifters and you're actually their coach, that might be something different. But for most of us, we're not the baseball pitching coach, and we don't need to be if that's not who we are. We need to be conferring with them and talking with them on where we can help maybe, but that's not where we need to live. And sometimes I think we put ourselves into that role a little bit too much in our thought process, where we need to just see where are they lacking some of the basic tenets first.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to think about it. So I think giving them the tools that they're going to use later to put into the skill, I think it's a really good a way to think about it. I think I had a lost my train. Another thought I just lost, but yeah, I think those are really good points. I think building that capacity, building that understanding of your body awareness and things. I think those are all beneficial when you actually get to the specifics of the skill. I agree. It definitely can help.
In college, we used to play multiple different sports in the off season just for the variety of movement, right? I mean, I was a basketball player, but we played multiple different things, soccer, different things, just because it was different. Those were kind of our small-sided sport games, and they were not basketball related, just simply so that we learn how our bodies move and how we relate to other people in space, not doing what we regularly do. And it's basically just to offload some of the tissue stresses while still getting some conditioning and getting some other things. And you're thinking in the game in a different way. And so it's novel approach. It's novel for neuroplasticity, all those other things. I don't think that was a thought process 30 years ago when I was playing, but it was still used at that point.
Yeah, no, I agree. There's a term people have started using now called donor sports. So this sport's kind of donating something that will make you better at your main sport. So yeah, I think there's a lot of merit to that. Obviously, I think playing other sports is good for burnout and tons of other reasons too. But I agree with all those things you said as well.
This might be off topic, but the concept of affordances. There was a paper, I don't know if you've read it, but it was by two more rehab researchers, Pain in the Field of Affordances. Have you heard of that paper that came out in 21?
I think so. Maybe. Yeah, I don't remember.
So we don't have to go into it, but they're trying to relate it from a more of a pain standpoint of what affordances do you have to get you maybe to view life through, and how that may affect your this of pain. But anyways, could you dive into definition of affordances and then maybe how it relates to just this topic as a whole? Because my understanding is affordances is your almost ability to have all these movement strategies. What can you perceive to do from a movement perspective? Is that close? to it?
Yeah, for sure. So affordances is an idea from a person named James Gibson. It's the idea that we perceive these opportunities for action in the world. So I'm playing sports and I see I'm carrying the ball. In basketball, I see the affordance for this situation affords me driving to the hoop. It affords me pulling up for a jump shot. It affords me passing through the gap, and so we pick up these opportunities for action. And I think the real important point for S&C and physiotherapy is your perception of affordances is directly related to your capacity, right? So I've seen a lot of cases where a player comes to me and the coach comes to me and say the player's making bad decisions, right? By the way the coach is viewing, they should have passed, or they should have driven through there, or should have done this. But it's not a decision. It's just they don't see that. They don't feel like they have the speed to get through there. They don't have the capacity to take advantage of that action. So yeah, so affordances are kind of opportunities for action. And I think really good athletes kind of, they see these opportunities that other players don't, and they have the ability to act on them. If that makes sense. But and I think pain's a real tough one. I've thought a lot about pain. It's a real, I would say it's kind of a constraint, is that, avoiding pain that, leads to, so the idea is that we kind of organize our movements around the constraints of our task, everything. And pain is one that's going to cause people to move and coordinate in a certain way that's not always really good. There's an interesting study where there's some studies where they've tried to get people to learn under pain conditions, and they've used there's one study I just read recently. They put this cream that's made from like red peppers, so I guess it burns, and they had people try to learn darts. It was a really interesting study, but they found there's some kind of maladaptive things that happen when you learn under conditions of pain. If you do it, I think that's where a physiotherapist really has to come in and know how to handle that and stuff. But yeah, it's a tricky one to fit into all of this for sure.
Any other questions? I know you have to leave in like 10 minutes, but does anyone have any other things they want to dive into? Dope. We can end it early if you want. Or
Okay.
Were there any things with the podcast or the paper that you feel like we didn't talk about that you feel like is important to address?
I don't think so. I just think there's a kind of a growing body, and it sounds like you guys are on this already, but like incorporating motor learning principles into physiotherapy and rehab, I think that's a really interesting growing area. I see more papers on it and talk about it. I think it's a really kind of potential for a lot of interesting things development. So I think that would be kind of the thing I would point at most.
Okay, there was one more question by Ashish. How does the fear of re-injury, such as tearing up their ACL again, affect performance or their focus, if at all?
Yeah, what we found in that study is it seemed to have a big effect on this internal focus, right? People are worrying about how their knee's going to move or how it's going to land, and that's causing them to shift attention. And a lot of it, I think, is worry about re-injuring. So for the base, and like in the baseball study I talked about, we measured like their ability to focus on other parts of their body that weren't injured, and it wasn't any different than uninjured people. So they were really particularly focused on the part of their body that had surgery. So I definitely think that's a large part of it, this fear of re-injury. And I don't know whether we can compensate for that partly by giving them, more range of motion and things, experiencing, how it's going to feel in in practice, but in therapy. But that is really hard to get rid of that fear. Yeah, that's a good point.
One more question. So I get I told you, like, we did have a motor learning class in our school, and they tell us like 15 different motor learning theories. What is like a practical way to go about deciphering like which ones are worth diving into? And it just seems like there's so many different avenues to look at from like the amount of theories. I feel like right now, like ecological dynamics or like some of that stuff is more, I don't know, well accepted, but do you have any advice of that for like students or just
Yeah, it
where to
is
look?
tough for me. Kind of, they fit into two large bins. I did a if anyone's interested, I did a YouTube video where I tried to go through like the two main skill acquisition theories. One's kind of the traditional repetition motor program idea, and the other one's, like you said, ecological dynamical systems approach. And I think most of them fit into one or the other. And I think it depends on how much you want to get into the subtleties of it. If you're mostly interested in the practical applications, I think I think you can dive into kind of any one of them. And I tried to lay out, like, I think once you start with the basics of them, they kind of branch off in different ways and have different implications for how you train and how you practice. And so I think it depends, I guess, what level you want to get into it. But I think if you choose one of those paths, they'll kind of guide you. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Rob, is it possible to be a model pluralist and use aspects of both of those models in practice?
I don't really, in the way that I kind of break it apart, I don't really think so. They're kind of fundamentally different in terms of right where they start. A lot of people don't agree with that, and a lot of people, there's been attempts to kind of combine them, the ideas, and a lot of people want to use that approach, but I personally think you can't really combine them. They're very, very different right from the start.
Well, just the point that Paul had made earlier, in terms of at some point you have to get the reps in. If you're a pitcher, if you're a musician, if you're a gymnast, you're going to be practicing a skill over and over, with the understanding that your bandwidth of variability is going to vary. I think that's intuitive to some degree, but would that not be a potential kind of just blending of these concepts where we can alter the motor landscape, and we can, provide you as many kind of open your bandwidth and have you walk through those affordance doors, but we also just have to get the reps in over time, let you mess up, let you explore, but repetition, exposure. Is that concept there not somewhat of a blend?
I guess on a theoretical level, I wouldn't think so. And I think the kind of repetitions that you would do and when you added it would be different for one of the approaches you believe. I think, if you really strictly believed in the repeatable delivery and there's one kind of way to pitch, then I don't know why you do the weighted balls and all that. You'd want to do just reps of basic pitching. Whereas if you're kind of more on the other side, I think you would want to add in more of the variability, so repetition without repetition in practice, I think. I think there's a lot of places that are going to look similar, I think, but I think they have kind of different places they come from and where they're going. Yeah, for sure. That makes sense.
So
as I said, a lot of people disagree with me. Yeah.
If I'm hearing you, you're saying the repetition intent is different. So one is to replicate the exact same movement. The other one is repetition for the sake of learning for the greater affordances within that to still get to the same outcome. Is that correct?
To get to repeatable outcomes. Yeah. You think about like how, I don't know if people play golf, but like you learn golf, like your coach immediately is getting you to repeat the one way to swing, right? Keep your feet this far apart, keep your head down, keep your like they're prescribing the solution to you, and then you keep repeating it over and over. Nope, you did that wrong. You did that wrong. And then we add variability later. Okay, now figure out how to do that thing you just did on a downhill. Now figure out how to do it on the uphill line. Whereas if you really believe kind of the repetition without repetition, you'd probably just let people play a whole bunch of different lies right from the start and learn the relationship between their movement. And kind of as a coach, you still have to kind of add constraints and chart, when they're doing things, way off out of the bandwidth. But I think it's just different ideas, where you want it to be and where you're starting, I think are very different. Yeah.
Quinn, was your question more based off of like, if they're still going to learn something like linearly, there's still going to be inherent variability of the learning process? Is that where you're going with it?
Yeah. I guess I see without the differential learning aspects where we're kind of forcing variability or saying, here are our options, and I'm going to step back, but just saying, here's the outcome. Here's a head start. So if I want to teach somebody how to shoot a basketball, I'm probably not just going to put a ball in their hand and say, all right, put the ball in the hoop. I mean, I might do that to just see what they do, but there's a reason that nobody in the NBA shoots underhand, because they're, over the course of millions of priors, we've on average figured out that there's a way to shoot a ball that tends to lead to a more consistent outcome. Guide hand, shooting hand, that type of thing. So there may be a starting point where we put somebody in and then step back, but it's the forcing of changing in the environment as opposed to just letting them get the reps in and letting the outcome inform them of trying something different, where it's still repetitions, and their variability bandwidth will kind of shrink down for a consistent outcome. But I guess I just naturally see a blending of these models with discrete skill. Now, in terms of putting that person in a game, in a chaotic environment for that perception and for them to be able to perceive these affordances, that's a totally different conversation. But just kind of pulling out these discrete elements of games is where I see kind of a blending.
Yeah, I could see that. I see, that's a good example. So one of the ways that people that follow kind of a more ecological approach coach basketball shooting is through an analogy. I want you to shoot imagine there's a cookie jar on the upper shelf and you're trying to get a cookie out of it. So I'm not telling you anything about the technique I want to use. I'm giving you kind of a bandwidth of the form of the movement. Whereas the traditional approach was put your hand here, do this with your arms. So I'm prescribing, it's prescription versus promoting exploration. But you're right, in practice, there's going to be, as I said, a lot of similarities for sure. I got to run. Sorry, I got to run. Unfortunately, guys, I got to pick up my kids. I would love to stay and talk longer, but
no worries, Rob. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay, cheers, guys.
Have a good one. Bye.
Yeah, thanks.